Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to continue our look at the next generation with this year's latest entry to the Call of Duty series, Black Ops Cold War. And we're going to see how it stacks up to last year's well-received reboot of Call of Duty Modern Warfare. For this comparison, both games are being played on the PC with the graphic settings cranked up to their highest settings at a native 4K resolution. However, the motion blur setting will be disabled for cleaner still images. So, let's kick this comparison off by first looking at some character and object models, starting with one of the only character models actually shared between both games, Frank Woods. Now, at first glance, these two models look very similar to each other, with the only obvious difference being the different clothing. But there are a few very subtle changes to the character himself. The first thing that really stood out to me was the general shape of his head. It's much rounder in Modern Warfare, with a wider jawline and a thicker neck. And he almost looks a bit older, with more visible wrinkles around his nose and mouth. And while it's certainly possible this was done on purpose to show the passage of time, the theory's a bit hard to believe considering there's about 40 years separating the two narratives. So, unless Woods ages remarkably well, it seems more likely that the difference between the model is purely the result of the artist's interpretation of the source material, that, despite the few minor changes I noted, comes pretty close to matching between the two games. As far as the actual quality goes, it's hard to say one looks better than the other. They both look extremely lifelike, with some fantastic looking shaders applied to the skin surface that react believably to the ambient light, and lots of fine details along their uniforms, all made up of some very high quality texture maps. However, I did find Cold War's textures to be a slight step up on average from Modern Warfare, with the stitching from various linens and leather pieces standing out more prominently than the often blurry details in the outfits before. It's a bit of a stretch, especially considering you'll pretty much never see these materials this close up under normal circumstances, but it's an improvement regardless. That being said, I do feel that the actual character animations, especially during dialogue sequences, was handled much better in Modern Warfare. The way characters like Price address the player feels so incredibly lifelike and has set the bar extremely high for the series. And I'd like to see this style eventually make its way into future Call of Duty titles as well. The animations in Black Ops aren't necessarily that bad. They're still some of the best in the first-person shooter genre, but it certainly feels like a bit of a step back. But now, let's turn our attention to the aspect you're going to be spending more of your time looking at, the quality of the first-person weapon models, starting with the classic AK-47. Now, the first difference that you'll probably pick up on here is that the AK on the left looks more worn and battle-hardened, while the AK in Black Ops looks a bit cleaner. This makes sense in the context of each of the game's respective settings, so it's hard to really knock Black Ops for lacking this detail. But there's also a few other minor changes, like the ridges along the top of the receiver cover in Cold War, and a few additional receiver bolts that could be part of this particular variant of the weapon. When firing the weapon, we can see that Treyarch has decided to adopt a similar technique that Infinity Ward used last time, with much less muzzle flash than the old games to help create something that looks more authentic. However, the recoil animation does feel a bit more stiff than what was presented in Modern Warfare, with only the back end of the rifle being kicked down vertically and very little weapon sway at all. The AK in Modern Warfare just feels so much more powerful, and I think this animation is a pretty big reason for that. Then we have the 1911 handgun, that now has a more reflective metal finish, along with an inscription along the slide. But interestingly, the way this weapon is held and its firing animation feels almost like a carbon copy of the one in Modern Warfare, with a very similar recoil pattern and kickback. Next, there's the MP5. Now, with this gun, there are quite a few cosmetic alterations between the two games. First, the hand grip appears to be vented in Cold War, as opposed to the wide forearm grip used in Modern Warfare. Also, Modern Warfare sports an empty rail on the top when no sight is attached, whereas the rail attachment is removed entirely in Cold War. And the rear stock adapter appears to feature a different texture than the rest of the weapon in Modern Warfare, whereas it looks to match the material of the gun in Cold War. With the firing animation, the MP5 seems to fire about the same, with a bit of a weapon sway and consistent vertical kick that matches what we saw in Modern Warfare as well. There's a number of other weapons that are shared between these two games, including a few that aren't exactly the same but serve the same purpose in terms of functionality. But for now, the general takeaway is that the weapon models seem to share the same excellent level of quality, only with a few cosmetic alterations to help match the retro setting. And while most weapons seem to function as intended, there are a few that just feel a bit off, either due to their recoil animation or the way the damage models are handled. Next up, we have environments. Modern Warfare did an absolutely fantastic job with its level designs, with some really authentic looking Middle Eastern mountainsides and towns, combined with some more urban areas in and around Russia. Single-player missions are still linear, and multiplayer maps are still built primarily for fast-paced arcade action, but it otherwise feels more realistic than the past several Call of Duty games. But Cold War does feel like a pretty significant step back in this regard. The single-player missions are fine and offer some great variety, including all-out warfare in Vietnam and some more stealthy missions that help to fit the theme of the game. But its multiplayer offerings feel much weaker. Each level is built around the classic 3-lane structure, meaning there's generally a main center path and 2 flanking routes on either side, usually with additional paths in between them all. And while Modern Warfare certainly employed a similar style for its multiplayer levels, they did a much better job of hiding it, by making each of the paths offer something drastically different from each other to help keep the action fresh and interesting. Take the multiplayer map Azhir Cave for example. It's built around 3 lanes, with the center lane being a sort of drained riverbed among ruined buildings, a side lane that goes through a dense cave network, and an alternate side lane along the cliffside. There's a pretty decent amount of variety in this map, and you can find a similar style used in most of the other maps in the game. But in Cold War, everything feels a bit too symmetrical. The map Armada is a perfect example of this, as it's practically identical on either side, and it ends up feeling really repetitive as a result. There's some exceptions to this, like Miami and Moscow, but even these maps feel very limited in regards to the number of paths available to the player. The maps in general feel much smaller in Cold War than they did in Modern Warfare. Some may like this, as it will no doubt lead to less camping and increased mobility, but it seems extremely common to either spawn trap a team or be spawn trapped yourself due to this limited scale. Now, Modern Warfare's maps were certainly not perfect. Levels like Euphrates Bridge come to mind, but there's still a few gems hidden in there, and the inclusion of several additional maps from the classic Call of Duty 4 and Modern Warfare 2 days have certainly helped add much needed variety to its multiplayer suite, and Cold War in its current state understandably can't compete with that. As far as the visual quality goes, we're again faced with 2 games that offer nearly identical levels of quality. The texture maps for things like the dirt all look great, and the cliff face geometry is pretty much on par with what we saw last year. There's even a few areas where Cold War looks better, like the bark along this tree trunk, and then other areas where Modern Warfare looks better, like this dynamic traffic cone prop. But the real tiebreaker comes with the lighting. This is an area where I think Black Ops most definitely begins to fall short in terms of its visual design. A lot of aspects I mentioned previously, like the weapon models, characters, and of course the environment, would have benefited greatly from improvements to the lighting to help enhance them. And Cold War frequently feels washed out and lifeless in some areas, but then overly bright and saturated in others. It feels really inconsistent, and it's a major contributing factor to Cold War's less realistic presentation. There are a few aspects of the lighting that work great. The volumetric lighting looks really good in some scenes, especially throughout the course of the campaign when working through dark tunnels with dim lights and fog effects. But then you look at a scene from Modern Warfare, and the contrast between the light and dark just feels far more believable, and gives the entire experience a much more authentic look. Now, just because Cold War doesn't look quite as realistic doesn't mean it's bad looking. I generally like its bright and vibrant locations, especially this mock-up of an 80s American arcade, complete with lots of glowing neon blue and pink. And the implementation of screen space reflections looks phenomenal in maps like Miami, which shares a similar artistic feel to Modern Warfare's Piccadilly, especially with its wet city streets and vehicles coated in small specks of water. Cold War also benefits from some ray tracing implementation on the PC, assuming you're using an RTX-enabled video card, that allows for softer shadows and improved ambient occlusion. Though the improvement is so subtle that it's really difficult to notice. In the end result, it's still an image that pales in comparison to last year's game. The shadows are at least on par with Modern Warfare. The ray-traced effects help to greatly soften environmental shadow effects like tree leaves and objects lit by interior lights, which makes for more realistic projections. And that dithering effect that plagued both Black Ops 3 and 4 doesn't seem to be an issue anymore, giving us a much cleaner image. The shadow render distance still isn't fantastic, and I frequently found distant shadows to get extremely pixelated, just like in Modern Warfare. But considering how rarely you'll experience long-range engagements compared to before, this isn't as much of a problem. Next, we have effects. Here we have a bit of a mixed bag. Some aspects look better in Black Ops, while some look better in Modern Warfare. The fire, for example, looks much better in Modern Warfare most of the time, especially from thrown Molotov cocktails. The fire is more expansive and the flame animation is more fluid, while the fire in Cold War seems to be made up of a few disappointing sprites. The effect from smoke grenades isn't quite as impressive in Cold War either. Rather than filling up an area with lots of dense cloud textures like before, it seems as though Treyarch wanted to try and make the smoke react a bit more realistically to the lighting, which is commendable, but the end result just feels much less effective from a gameplay perspective, and it ends up looking more like a wall of gray rather than an actual cloud of smoke. With the explosives, I'm a bit torn. I love the increased particle density from the shrapnel in Modern Warfare, with lots of yellow streaks flying in every direction, as opposed to the few in Cold War. But the huge cloud of dust and smoke that kicks up from the sand in Cold War feels so much more impactful. You could probably argue that the sand isn't nearly as thick in this particular area of Modern Warfare, which is definitely true, but still, the quality of the fireball from frags, Semtex, and especially C4 is much more visually interesting in Cold War than its predecessor. Alongside these improved explosions, Cold War also sports more realistic water effects. Though for good reason, as Modern Warfare's water generally doesn't play any role in the gameplay. You can spot some water out of bounds in some of the levels, but for the most part it's not really in the game. Cold War, however, brings back the ability to swim in some areas, and you can even swim under the surface and fire your weapon if you want, though this feature isn't utilized nearly as much as it was in older titles like Black Ops 3. So, to summarize, Black Ops Cold War holds up remarkably well from a visual perspective against its year-old predecessor. The character models are roughly on par, the environments, while not quite as interesting, still look great, and effects like explosions and water feel like a slight improvement. However, Cold War's lighting seems to be the biggest factor holding it back, with a color tone that just feels unnatural when compared to Modern Warfare. Now, let's switch gears for a little bit and talk about quite possibly the most important changes that have been made to the gameplay design, starting with the general player movement and abilities. So right away, the first thing you'll find is missing in Cold War is the tactical sprint. The tactical sprint could be triggered in Modern Warfare by double tapping your sprint key, which was either shift on your keyboard or the left joystick if you played on console. This maneuver greatly increased your speed on the ground for a short time, and could be extended by equipping a specific perk. But Cold War reverts back to just a single sprint option, which is pretty weird to get used to again. Things like sliding, vaulting, and climbing feel about the same, though the slide seems to be a bit shorter. Treyarch also has addressed drop shotting in Cold War by forcing players out of their ADS when entering the prone stance, forcing them to re-enter it after the prone animation is complete. This can be bypassed by using a specific attachment now available in the customization menu, but it otherwise should help to prevent the maneuver from being used as often as it was in Modern Warfare. Other changes include the removal of the mounting option for all weapons, something that I can't say I'm going to miss after the annoying requirement to mount weapons when unlocking weapon skins. But I will miss the ability to wield a pistol while climbing up and down ladders, which was a very nice feature, especially when dealing with players that like to camp inside of elevated structures. Cold War also tweaks the list of perks and killstreaks, many of which return from past Treyarch games like the RCXD remote control car bomb and the Napalm Strike. And the wildcard system also makes a comeback, which can grant some extremely useful options for customization, including the ability to use more perks or even the ability to equip an extra 3 attachments for a primary weapon, on top of the 5 already available. There doesn't seem to be any sort of downside to using these wildcards at the moment, so it's definitely worth equipping the one that you feel suits your playstyle best. Field upgrades from Modern Warfare also make a return, though they aren't nearly as useful. Dead Silence, for example, is now a perk again, but there are new field upgrades to deploy, like a microphone to detect enemy movement on radar within a short radius, or a proxy mine that is very effective in defending objective locations. But one of the biggest changes that I think hurts Call of Duty Cold War's general feel is its time to kill. Weapons in Cold War feel really weak compared to their counterparts in Modern Warfare. What's more, Treyarch also added in things like armor panels as killstreak rewards, and health bars for enemies that makes the game remarkably more like an arcade shooter than Modern Warfare was. It still plays fine, but I think lowering the time to kill would greatly improve the flow of the action, and make more weapons than just the sniper rifles, M16 and MP5 actually usable. Then of course, there's the available game modes. As with every Treyarch game, Call of Duty Cold War sees the return of the fan favorite Zombie Survival mode, only with a number of pretty big changes that I'll go over with my final review later. This mode replaces the somewhat disappointing Spec Ops mode from the previous Modern Warfare. and is already much more enjoyable from what I've played. Cold War also includes a few new competitive modes, like a large-scale conquest-style mode just like Modern Warfare's Ground War, and the intense Dirty Bomb, that feels a bit more like a fast-paced war zone, with infinite respawns and a new objective to collect uranium deposits and secure them at bomb sites to bank points. This mode also includes a lot of incredibly lethal vehicles like this attack helicopter, though it does seem like a bit much. I think toning down the amount of tank and heli spawns would make this mode much more bearable. But it's otherwise a great idea, and I can see it being a great alternative for Warzone for the time being. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. Now again, most of these guns aren't the exact same variant, so we should expect some differences in the way they sound. But this should still give you a good enough idea of how the two titles handle their sound design. So knowing this, which game do you think has a better overall sound quality?
Out of ammo!
And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Call of Duty Cold War is kind of a mixed bag when held up to last year's excellent Modern Warfare. I think there are several aspects that Cold War does a great job with, including an interesting campaign experience with a bit of replay value, a fun alternative zombie survival mode, and, aside from the lighting, a mostly solid visual design. But many aspects in regards to its combat design feel flawed. Not including things like tactical sprint and increasing the time to kill makes firefights feel more arcadey than they should in a Call of Duty game, and I'd like to see this addressed with an update in the future if possible. I think if you really liked Modern Warfare and are on the fence about grabbing Cold War, you can probably hold off for the time being. The returning crossplay option should ensure that the online community remains plenty active after a few more updates. And hopefully, many of the issues that players are experiencing currently, like disconnects, crashing, weird artifacts, and the very limited choice in multiplayer maps, will be addressed by then. But if you prefer the more competitive, fast-paced level designs that Treyarch brings to the table, and are looking to jump in, you shouldn't notice too much of a visual difference one way or the other. And I'm very curious how the inclusion of new Cold War weapons and characters will impact the popular Warzone experience when the new season finally arrives. But until then, what do you guys think? Are you impressed by the visuals of Call of Duty Cold War, or do you still prefer the look and feel of Modern Warfare? Let me know in the comment section, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos of all the latest next-gen games every week.